Are you struggling to get exposure for your company? Not really sure how to get in front of all the big news media outlets, TechCrunch, and end up on the cover of Time magazine? Well, if so, you're not alone. I'm sitting down with an industry veteran, Donna Loughlin, who has been at this for a very long time. She has her own agency, works with mission-driven tech startups, innovators, and works with clients all over the globe and helping them not only get that one-time big exposure in TechCrunch and in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, but how do you actually have a consistent PR strategy that really tells your story on an ongoing basis, as well as implementing some of those big wins in the overall strategy? So this is a fun episode. Donna talks about her own experience, as well as what you can do to start to build PR and when it might make sense to bring somebody on board. It's a really interesting conversation. We do a little bit of workshopping throughout the episode as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Silicon Alley podcast featuring the Donna Loughlin. Are you interested in growing and scaling your business? Welcome to the Silicon Alley podcast, where you'll hear from entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and top performers on what it truly takes to grow and scale a business. You'll walk away with actionable insights you can apply in your own business and life. Now to William Glass, the CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and your host of the Silicon Alley podcast. Donna, welcome to the Silicon Alley podcast. Super excited to have you on today.
Well, I am so excited to join you. I'm in Silicon Valley, but I really like Silicon Alley as well.
Yeah, we were chatting just before we hit record, and it sounds like your productivity levels are different depending on which coast you're on.
Absolutely. When you're on Eastern time, you just get that +3 extra, motivation to just, do a lot more. And in the entrepreneur world that we live in, a few extra hours is always, bountiful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you could put more hours in the day, I think a lot of people would take you up on that offer, especially in the startup world. So Donna, it would be great if you could start and give a little context, because you've been in the Silicon Valley, in the startup world, specifically on the storytelling and the PR side. So we'd love to get a little background context for the audience, and then we can kind of dive in from there.
Yeah, the virtual world that we live in, it's interesting because to me, Silicon Valley mystique has elasticized itself around the world. There's lots of different pockets of innovation and technology. You're in one of them. I'm in another in Silicon Valley. I work with clients in the tech valleys of other countries, whether they be in Australia or in Atlanta, Georgia, or Los Angeles. There's so many different innovation centers, which is amazing. My clients, cast a very wide net over the last 20 years that I've had my agency in five continents, which is pretty exciting. So to be in North America, but working with entrepreneurs around the world, bringing innovation, to life and to market that amplify and improve our life. And so a lot of the companies I work with are really cause driven, meaning that they are in markets that we care about now, sustainability and electrification and artificial intelligence and food supply, and those things that we are now embracing. But the Zoomers and the millennials have been pushing the agenda for a while. But early on in my tech sector, I was working with a lot of cybersecurity and a lot of what I call deep learning and pre-AI technologies, and a lot of consumer tech products, anything you can put in your house, pocket, or your home. And the storytelling component of that is something that is really where I focus, is my craft, is helping, working with the entrepreneurs to find that authentic story that's going to bring their product to market and make it tangible and believable. So people like you and I, or a business, embrace and adapt and adopt.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for that background, Donna. And yeah, it's got to be interesting working across continents and countries and seeing startups all across different sectors, companies that are building really interesting things. I'd love to dive into that last piece that you talked about, though, around authenticity. So can you talk to me about why that's so important and how you can kind of find that authentic voice? Because I feel like as an entrepreneur, you have an idea of what you're doing, but sometimes it's very verbose and story, but you kind of want a nice, clear, concise story is my assumption, but I don't want to put words in your mouth if that's not the case.
Yeah, too often in technology, people start with the I want to call it the geekiness of things, how it works. I really want to focus on why, the impact it's going to make. And to go through that discovery process oftentimes is like sitting down just the way you and I are sitting and chatting. But going back to what was that moment in which the individual decided that they wanted to fix or change something? What's the problem, and how did that problem manifest? And was there a moment, or was there an incident, or was there a happy accident? Typically products aren't just created in like a big idea lab and say, let's create this thing because it's going to do this. Science fairs are great for that. And I love science fairs and that approach. But when we talk about, bringing a product to market, the individual that has oftentimes forgets that moment that they were actually thinking, wow, I'm going to create this, because they get so involved in the creation and the engineering and the coding and the development of product. And then if it's a consumer product, the design, and they forget that moment. So oftentimes I pull things out like, well, when they were kids, they were working with, Legos, or they were, fascinated with Minecraft, or that led to an engineering, which led to, building a house of the future, or they were constantly playing with, with remote control cars and Matchbox and Hot Wheels and things from the past that our kids don't really play with as much, but perhaps that made influence them to create an electric car of the future. So I really take them on a discovery process and help them find that childlikeness in them and bring it to the surface.
I like that. So you've got a podcast where you do this right before it happened is the name of the podcast. So you're an expert, it sounds like, in helping tease this out. So you go really far back, it sounds like. You're like, it's not like the moment you decided to start the company, it's even deeper, it sounds like.
Yeah, the Before It Happened podcast is really about that moment, right? That I take people, and that's kind of a process. That's why I created the show, because I talk to so many people in my network that aren't necessarily my clients, but they have a fascinating story. They might be a little too early on to be my client, or they might be working with, with a PR agency, but looking for another expert or authority opinion. So I don't quite take them on like a couch and a notepad session, like a another professional, would might do. But it's a lot of, whiteboard chats and taking a deep dive. I look at trends, what's happening in the marketplace. I look at the, what the market is commanding. Are there trends such as, we in California, where I live, we have a mandate for clean energy and zero emissions. And so 2030 is going to be here before we know it. So, how's that going to affect, the market or the opportunity if you're bringing an EV product to market? Things such as the war, or the pandemic, or new competition or old competition. I work with an electric tractor company, for example, and they were first to market with a driver optional electric tractor. And John Deere obviously is a big giant in the tractor industry, and they're catching up. So how do you make sure that you're going to stay ahead and be the authority and the lead, and not become the challenger brand? And so that's very important in looking at, the landscape of the market. And really the last thing I look at is the what I call the speeds and feeds, anything that you put on a data sheet. And that's important, but that's unfortunately, that's oftentimes where people start. And if you think of Inspector Gadget, that movie that Matthew Broderick did years ago, I like that film because you'd open up his jacket and there'd be all these things. And you'd say, well, that's really cool, magic trick. But like, do we need it? Right. And so I have access to some great think tanks. We have Solve for X, and we have SpaceX, and we got, all these different accelerators, and not just in California, around the world. And so I get exposed to a lot of things under NDA, and sometimes things really blow my mind. I go, wow, how did we how have we lived without this? And other times I wonder, like, do we need this? And so what I really need to zoom in and be very selective, and I can be selective, um, is working on the things that I think are going to make impact. And so very cause driven things that personally, spark my attention and my interest.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Donna, wanting to be make sure the things that you're working on you believe should be in the world and are worth promoting and helping get out there and tell the story around. I'm curious because you referenced that, I mean, obviously you work with certain stage companies and certain stage startups. There is probably a point in time where it doesn't make sense for PR, or does it always make sense for PR? I understand the story, like that probably is something that's important, kind of from day one, and formulating and you're crafting that as you build the product and get more customer feedback. But in terms of going out to the market and saying, hey, we're here, how do you think about that from a startup perspective, and when is it time to go, tell your story to the world?
Yeah, there's a couple of phases actually. So there's a pre-launch or pre-market phase, which is where you're positioning and story development, and I have to say that the market analyst and the research groups before the market influencers, which are typically the media and some of the social media influencers or review editors. That's really phase two. So phase one is really to do all your market homework, and it's like knowing who your competition is, looking at the landscape, looking at any potential what I call hazards, preventative versus being reactive. So what is the worst case scenario that could happen, with the product? And so we need to look at those things, right? And so I fly. And so one of the things that I constantly tell when I go through this process is when you're a pilot, it's a little different than when you're driving a car. There's a lot more that could happen. Weather is conditions and air traffic control and all the different checkpoints of things that you need to know when you fly are very important to be prepared. And so the same thing with a product, we need to be prepared for worst case scenario, worst case weather, right? So phase one is really looking at all the things before we go to market. Then we start phase two, which is basically the pre-qualification, talking to the market analyst or talking to some long lead media and some of the influencers, beta customers, if we have it. And then phase three is really the launch period, which is the cotillion, I like to say, was you take the product, take the baby out for the first time in the stroller and parade him around. And that can be done in a lot of ways. That can be done in small group sessions. It can be done in a podcast series, an educational series. It can be done with, press one-on-ones. It can be done in pop-ups now that we're back out and doing things live, small pop-up experience communities, particularly when you have a product like an electric bicycle or electric motorcycle or electric tractor. People want to see an experience, right? So those are the three phases. And those phases typically, in a real perfect scenario, should be 6 months to a year. I have actually done it in less than 10 days, which I don't recommend for the for the
Oh,
for the
wow.
nov for the novice person, but 10 days, to launch. I've worked in that scenario, but typically it's a 90 days minimum. We can move very fast and furious, within with a small company. And oftentimes I'll work with companies on what I call a jump start. If they're pre-funded and they need to get visibility and get exposure to bring their product to market, then we'll work with them on a special kind of jump start scenario where we get them. Do you remember TGIF Fridays and in those movies where they'd have the flare, the bat, the suspenders, and they have the different flair? Well, my job is to give them that kind of good old 80s feeling of like 5 pieces of flair. So get you in TechCrunch, or get you in Forbes, or get you in some Wall Street Journal, someplace that's going to help you get that funding conversation going. And so the smaller, younger entrepreneurial experience, is something that you just need to get the dial moving.
Yeah.
A company that's a little more mature, that's had the product, say, in beta and has been out for a while, that's where, full throttle is continuously looking at different and new stories to bring to market. So competition could change, the weather can change, the executive team members can change, the product version can change, lots of different variables. So it's not a rinse and repeat. It's really, rinse and recondition and really knowing the market.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Donna. And yeah, it sounds like you can go through these phases multiple times, right? As different life cycles, as you new products or maybe new positioning. And I'm glad you addressed the kind of jump starting the conversation, because when I think about like what Robinhood did, if you're familiar with how they did their referral program and the whole wait list, and they didn't have the product live, but they were still getting a lot of press, and had a way to at least capture the leads that were coming in and use that as a way to like have a bigger launch.
Yeah, it was like a mini crowdfunding, scenario almost, right? I mean, Tesla did a really great job, and I see Cadillac doing it now too, with their electric car. Is that create the frenzy and get people to sign up, and it's like a countdown. It's not quite here, but sign up, put your $1,000 down, and I think Tesla did it with 100, but Cadillac does it with 1,000. I keep getting their emails. And if you haven't looked at the new electric Cadillac, it's quite stunning. It's like they brought an all European team to kind of resuscitate, a strong American brand. But that process, I think, is so important. And being able to, you want to rally people early on. And I worked with a company, one of my first clients 20 years ago at my agency was a social media monitoring service. And you think about it, some people might think social media wasn't around 20 years. We invented it. No, you didn't. It's been around a while. And it was basically what we did with the new product is we got 50 of the most influential editors to use the product under NDA. And every week we'd give them an update and we'd get their feedback. So they were part of a mini beta group. And that 50, it was my nifty 50, I called it. We got the nifty 50 to constantly give us feedback. And once we finally got to a few product milestones that we felt really that was solid, we then brought the product to market and we let them know in 10 days, we're going to launch this product. And so they had 10 days to write their stories. And we had 50 articles come out the day of the launch because we had 50 highly conditioned, real experts of using the product. Now that's not going to happen every scenario. Sometimes you want, 5 people conditioned under embargo to be part of that experience. But I think that's one of the key components that oftentimes people forget. And I went to CES 2020 this year. It was not super, heavy traffic audience, but walking the show and looking at what was hot and what won awards is really interesting because you think of consumer electronic products, you think of big box stores and the products that we can put in our pocket, but there were, smart appliances and there were, the smart cars and there are smart, smart toys and smart sports equipment and smart wearables and everything's smart. Everything was, and that was like the one thing was like, wow, the IQ just went way up. But being able to see the products and to experience them before they come, and this is what I always liked about crowdfunding campaigns, is it was a little bit of a peep show, right? Is you get a little bit of a, like, okay, tell me more. And I think that that's a technique that, Robinhood did that really well. I actually work with a company, Interactive Brokers, and they have an app called Impact. And Impact is a values-based investment app that is for the Zoomers and millennials primarily. It's like not your father's investing app. It's, for the younger generation. And it's great. But one of the cool opportunities with that was in the ESG world, there was a lot of thoughtfulness and put into the product, and to know that the experience of the product when it came out was ready to go. So I think, there's not like a one size fits all approach. I think one of the things that's really important, if you ever bought paint and you go to a paint store and you get all these little paint swabs, and my kids used to love to grab these things because it was like art. They'd go back home and get all this paper and make things. But when you want to match, look at how many different colors of eggshell or white or black or blue, the basic colors. There's so many different shades. And it's like, so you have to look at your approach to bringing your product or your service to market the same way you look at paint, in my opinion, is like, it's not a color match for everyone. It's a color match for your own personal taste, but also for your own personal needs. So you're raising funding. Are you trying to raise funding and attract talent? Are you bringing a product to market? Are you replacing a product to market, a product that you're making obsolete? Are you trying to rally and challenge competition? Are you getting ready for a holiday season? We're getting right now, it's dads and grad season, right? So there's lots of different variables to look at. Like, what is that? You need to raise X amount of likes and followers is probably not the best measurement.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense, Donna. I guess, building off that last point there, let's just zoom in on, say, fundraising. Let's say maybe you've raised a little bit of capital, but you're kind of still in that stage. You've got inklings of product market fit, but you're not really there yet. You're not quite ready to just put it out there to the masses. How would you go about that kind of storytelling PR? Like, would you look for traditional PR? Is that a TechCrunch article? Does that help?
So
Or,
let's come up with a fake product. Give me your product. What is your product?
I mean, I can give you, so I'm Ostrich. We've built a financial fitness app for college students, and it's essentially like Strava or Peloton for finances. So groups of people working towards goals together.
Love it. So have you done like a pop-up at universities and got firsthand feedback from students?
So we just completed a pilot with Rollins College in Orlando, my co-founder and I's alma mater.
Awesome. Can you expand that to a couple more universities?
For sure. Yeah, definitely could. Now we're gathering feedback to build off of it, but absolutely. Yeah.
So I think geographically, one of my thoughts would be demographically are regionally, is it the same feedback that you're going to get? So universities love projects like this, right? Where they get students involved. But I think that beta, that content that you're collecting could be valuable as your original content. You own that content and that feedback. So can you write a positioning paper that talks about the state of the market and the behavior, the demographics? And so that umbrella of being able to tell why it changes in the air, right? And I think that becomes a good opportunity and opener to have the conversations with like market analysts. So there's consumer groups that, specializes, like Frost and Sullivan, is an example of one. Another one would probably be, to Institute of the Future or something like that. That's kind of different, but there are ways to, to get, to, I would say, two-way conversations. But I think the content-wise, having a positioning paper makes a great conversation starter with an editor. So you have a couple of markets you can speak to. You can speak to the investment market. You can speak to your younger demographic that are reading Refinery, and they're reading, things like BuzzFeed, and they're maybe reading, CNET and maybe Vice and places like that. They're a little more contemporary. But I'd also look at women investments. How are women investing versus, gender-based investing? Or is there like an opportunity for the LGBTQ community? Or is there an opportunity for generations, college students to their parents, conversations, different ways of looking at where these conversations could be held? And then I think you tested out a couple of messages, which is what I call the narrative story engine. It's not, as I said, it's not one size fits all. But is there a David and Goliath story opportunity? Can you actually challenge somebody else that's already in the market? Is there an opportunity? The founder story, is the founder story really unique? How do we make it more unique? Is there the needs demand story? So how do we actually show those demand in the market? And that's what your paper would show. But also an infographic would be a great way to show this as well. It's very visual, it's very tangible, and you can tell a story through pictures. And then I think the personas are really key. If you can capture sound bites in sessions, or you create personas, they don't have to be real people. I tell people, when people say, "Oh, I have to get a quote from somebody," like, no, I write those quotes all day long. We put words in people's mouth, and they can audit, they can check. But being able to abstract those sound bites of these personas, so just making it up. Meet Morgan. Morgan, is a sophomore in college and has actually been able to budget $150 a month in investment. It just, persona rides a scooter, is vegan, and loves watching, Silicon Valley show, as well as, I don't know, Top Chef. Just making it up, right? Yeah. And then on the other side, you got, you have, Xavier, and Xavier he's not a vegan, and he, rides a motorcycle, and he's really into, all the old epic Star Wars and collector, superhero t-shirts, but maybe he has, a side hustle selling superhero stuff, and he has $500 a month that he can spend. So I think it's just creating, like, you want to draw people in so they
Mhm.
can associate with people like me, right?
Makes
So
sense.
I'm probably not your audience, but I have known enough about looking at these demographics, and my own kids would be in your demographic, is you want to draw people in, into that, captivate them in. I want to be, I want to be like William. I want to be like Morgan, right?
Yeah, so it sounds like really showing people like the value to them, like they can see themselves in the stories. Like you can be a better version of yourself if you use this app.
Yeah. Well, the impact, right? And so
Yeah.
I've noticed I haven't even talked about like what it does, the features or the products, because that that's the next step down. Is like, well, why is William so happy? Why is he so happy that he's doing, and it's because then you talk about, I start my every day, I start this is part of my regime, after I meditate, I do this, right? And then this makes, in goal setting. But I think that's oftentimes what people lose, get lost with products, is that they immediately think, I'm going to be in cover of Time magazine. I want to be in the cover of, Wall Street Journal. And the places that I think are important for a younger company to be is to know exactly where your audience is going to be. So for you, like university publications, as well as like the lifestyle, publications are going to be really important. Men's Health, Women's Fitness, um, GQ, Maxim Magazine, and then a lot of the online digital ones I mentioned, plus the universities newspapers. And there's a lot of university newspapers that shut down during the pandemic, but for the most part, they're operating again.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, Don. And I think you brought up an interesting point there. Like, yeah, everyone wants to be on Time, cover of Time or Wall Street Journal, being very targeted to the audience, but
I mean,
those are
I
also,
do.
right? Yeah, exactly. But those are also like a moment in time typically, right? Like you're not going to be on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, for the next 12 months in a row.
Yeah,
So
I
how
I
do you think
use
about like, kind of that like cuz there's those spikes but also like continuously building a kind of reliable base.
yeah, I used to do this little boot camp called How to Be in TechCrunch in 90 days. And people go, 90 days. And I'm like, you're not ready. I'm like, it's like getting ready for a marathon. You have one shot in a conversation with a top TechCrunch reporter to get a story that's actually going to help bring you, hopefully, revenue, investment, and magnitude, right? Or fortitude. And so you need to be really buttoned up with that conversation. The conversation with, with the TechCrunch, which was really looking at trend and early emerging markets, is really different than a conversation with Wall Street Journal. I've had, mentioned some Wall Street Journal in an article that can help company raise hundreds of millions of dollars. And I've had double pages in the Wall Street Journal that, the day the product came out, the company actually folded because they didn't have enough funding. So it could go either way, right? But
Yeah.
I think there is really knowing, who your audience is. And I want to say I kind of spoil my clients a little bit because I aim really high. I'm thinking, okay, if I can have a perfect trifecta, what will it be for this jumpstart program coming out of the gate, right?
Mhm.
And so I've had companies, for example, I work with a robotics company. And when I first started working with them 7 years ago, our first three articles that came out were USA Today, New York Times, and Reuters. Well, Reuters cast it around the world, right? And USA Today is kind of like the people's paper and underneath the hotel. But at the time, they had a tech editor that made sense to be in this emerging market kind of section. And New York Times was really key because the first deployment for this particular robot was in that market area. So it was very strategically planned. And from that, there was, what I call a rolling thunder, meaning that we had more articles that came out. And to keep that continuous momentum, it's, as I mentioned before, it's like the weather. You have to check the weather. What's is the story, and it's had this conversation yesterday. The story might get becoming a little tired. You might need to refortify it and give it a little extra boost with some new market facts or some new research or things that we could control. We can't control the weather, but we can control the performance of a product. We control our customer feedback to a degree. We can control any original content, such as reports or research or like the infographics I mentioned. So what I operate very editorial driven, not news release driven. So press releases typically are, people's expectation is you issue a press release and it's going to rain. I'm like, no, all the footwork needs to be done. If you're a publicly traded company, then there are very specific reasons why you have to issue a press release, right? For earnings and quarterly and those types of things. But when you're a privately held company, I think the number one thing that somebody should strive for is market authority. And so be the expert, right? Be the expert, and then be able to show proof of concept with your product, whether that be with customers or with product reviews. And those are the three things that really matter in creating a brand for an early stage entrepreneur or company.
Yeah, I love that, Donna. I think that's really helpful to think through. So, like the editorial piece, building authority, and then what was the third one? Just to recap.
The editorial and what I call a proof of concept, and like, prove it to me, show me. It's just a magic trick, right? It's like,
Yeah,
okay, it's
absolutely.
beautiful. People like objects of art, but show me proof of concept that it works.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, right? Otherwise, it's just an idea and a theory, and yeah, that doesn't have as much weight behind it as if you actually have real proof points and data. Because you've been talking about story, but you've also been, and I've noticed this, you've been talking about having facts or concrete things that you can point to, whether it's a user story or something that actually can prove out the claims that you're making about your startup and the impact that you're having.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think, assuming that it's not a solopreneur, meaning somebody who's on their own, but oftentimes it is. I've worked with companies that are, two guys and a cat because they can't afford the dog or the dog food. And so I think the entrepreneur's journey, is one that I just embrace, because people come to me when they've mortgaged their house, they sell their cars, they're, taking their kids out of private school, they were in public school, they moved, to remote places so they can keep their operational costs down, or they moved to very expensive places like where you or I live. And they come because they have a vision and a drive to succeed. And that entrepreneurial spirit, you see it around the world, is just really, the energy is great.
Yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, taking advantage of that founder story. So, Donna, anything else that you think is really important when it comes to thinking about branding, PR, telling that story at the early stages that we haven't touched on?
The one thing I think is really important is, we talked, a little bit about the proof of concept, but the validation, right? And I think what's one of the things that oftentimes people forget is the power of an effective, product review or a blogger review, or it's kind of an old fashioned kind of thing, process, but unboxings are the modern day version of that. And I think if you have a product that can go through an unboxing process, I think, that's something that, you should consider. The other thing I think is so important is what I think is agility, is being able to adjust as needed. And it's a little bit like a willow tree, right? Is that you need to be agile and being able to know when you need to redirect and when you need to change something along the way. And a company that, was formed in last year has to be looking and thinking about the next 5 years, but you're so caught into the moment of what's happening now. But think about all the things everybody's faced in the last few years. If you weren't agile and you weren't able to be resilient in numerous different conditions in the market, and now a lot of people talking about supply chain, but I think agility needs to be factored into the entrepreneurial dialogue. And some people are better at it than others. But even you look at Elon Musk, he's not had all successes. He's had some fails. He will be one of the first to actually say, he's had failure. and we learn from failure. But to be able to look at that and be agile, and I'm sure you've had many nuances where you've had to adjust. And I always tell you, Nest thermostat does it automatically. It's a product I actually worked on, but Nest thermostat actually does it automatically. Human nature is resistant. We don't do it automatically. It's not a natural act. So agility has to be a learned thing.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Being able to adjust, something doesn't work or something changes, being able to actually be, as you said, agile and adapt is really, really important.
Yeah, with your company, I mean, what kind of agility moves did you have to, I say like a cat, did you have to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that we started off with one customer segment and have moved to two or three others. And that's partly because of who's adopted it and then where we started to see uptick. And so had to have been agile. And that means changing the narrative of the story. So like AARP, believe it or not, is an investor in our company because they're mission aligned, but they're far from our core demographic. So explaining how, 50 plus nonprofit has invested in our company but we're targeting college students is cognitively dissonant. So being able to adjust from a narrative perspective, but also, adjust from a product perspective and what that means for the needs of each individual user, because they're very different.
Yeah. Is there a different demographic that you want to attract?
What we've been focused on is our go-to-market is a little unique. So like we're very much focused on the end user, but because we don't want to, from a monetization perspective, in order to provide our platform for free, because we're ultimately trying to target people that are in the worst financial situations and need us the most, but can't afford to pay, we've got to figure out a way that we can fund the company and then ultimately be able to serve that population. And so our go-to-market is through organizations that can afford to provide ostriches a benefit in the short term, and then long-term open it up for everyone to utilize, right? So thinking through, there's different buyers, right? So the college is a buyer. Long-term from there we'll move to the employer as the buyer and providing it to their employees. And so the needs of each individual are very different. But at the end of the day, if the product doesn't work for the end user, it doesn't matter. So like that's our kind of North Star of making sure that we actually can improve people's financial situations. And that's what we're tracking. And then from there, it's how do we explain the value to a college, right? And how do we plug in with their needs as the buyer? And then how do we plug in from the employer side, retention, attracting talent, but starting with, employers that are struggling, right? That have low wage employees where it's hard to attract and retain talent, but are also in our target demographic. So I kind of went all over the place, but this is how we've been thinking about, approaching what we're building, our story, and then also how we adapt the product and the product experience.
Excellent. Yeah. And then what kind of feedback do you feedback group, or do you use social media, or do you have like a customer portal? Where do you get that feedback?
Yeah. So we've done a combination of things. We've done focus groups, we've done surveys, and, obviously we can look in the product. So we've ran some pilots recently since we recently got the product out there in people's hands. So we ran a couple pilots. So based on the data, we've been able to adjust, but then it's just, having conversations, setting up times with individuals and reaching out to gather feedback, as well as just having conversations with people that are not currently users that are in that target demographic. So, every time I bump into a college student or we go and, I'm in a Lyft or an Uber, I'm asking the driver questions, but ultimately, it's a combination of different things that we've been using.
Yeah. The constant craving, or I like to say constant canvassing, is so important, right? Because you never know. This is the thing about storytelling. Everybody has a story, and you never know. The person that is sitting next to you at a counter, or in an Uber, or standing in line at the grocery store, could be a prospect or could be a link to something else, because you never know, right? And I've had some amazing clients come my way by just having a quick chat. I mean, I've shared a taxi with somebody once that ended up being one of my first clients 5 years after I had started my business, because I was a news reporter first and I was in the tech world, and then I started my business. But that taxi ride, I kept that card, and I knew at some point it was going to be valuable, but I didn't need it yet. Connecting on LinkedIn is very powerful. And so I try to collect as many you know, connect with as many people on LinkedIn. My podcast has been a very powerful networking component, is that people will listen to a podcast and they'll come back and they will say, I listened to a particular episode. I'm an expert in this topic. I'm a researcher. I can provide some more information. They're not necessarily calling to connect with me to be a guest, but because I get geek out and get a little thirsty on certain topics and they just want to be helpful. I just had a guest on my show, and a few weeks later, he sent me a bunch of articles that he'd been collecting on a certain topic as it related to automobile safety, because it came up in our conversation. And he's an industrial designer in transportation, and so he sent me this nice collection. So I value those types of connections, and I think, as I say, conversation. There's a couple of equalizers: laughter, food, and stories are three things that we really, it's in the human nature, to be able to collect those. The book that I'm working on that I need to focus and kind of hide away in my farmhouse, it is basically the art of storytelling, how to be your own PR agent, how to actually, as an entrepreneur, you might not have the funding or the tools to go to market. I'm going to provide the guidelines and the wisdom to help you do that. And you could also apply it to your own personal brand, your own personal persona, which is you and your career. Because oftentimes people forget that we are our brand. And if you're interviewing for a job, I look at a lot of resumes and I immediately try to connect the dots. Like, what is the common thread here? What is being an Eagle Scout and being, a champion, Game Boy or multi-game player, or a race car driver, and winning 3 science? What does they have to do anything, right? Or if resumes, what my intern is a great example. She's working on an organic berry farm. But she had also worked at a STEM nonprofit. I look at that and I said, wow, I have a lot of questions there, because she's interested in agriculture and sustainability and like the earth. And she also is interested in like STEM and education. I looked at that and I said, hey, I have an electric tractor, autonomous self-driving tractor that is super smart and works on farms. She might be a great candidate, right? And so she didn't see it on her resume because she didn't even know this product existed. But being able to stand back and look at how do you apply your own PR structure, the structure I'm going to provide allows people to build their own persona, their own story as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes
We forget our roots sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I like that because it's also interesting because some of those are work experiences, but I also, there's also like when you think about connecting with somebody, oftentimes it's the things that aren't on a resume that you talk about, like, oh, you're both runners or both love traveling or artisan cheeses or whatever that unique thing is.
Oh, I love artisan cheeses. I have a book, 375 cheeses in France. There's no way you can get through all those cheeses, through all that cheese. Yeah, well, I think that's if you get out of your zip code. And I always tell this to my interns. And I always have at least 2 interns a year. Last couple of years was a little harder, but people need to get out of their comfort zone. You need to look at things differently. You need to go into another zip code at the very least, needless to say, another state, another country. I have traveled close to 80 countries. I've retired 6 passports. One of them had to be replaced. Another one, I needed like more visas to go to Russia and to go to other parts of the Far East or the Middle East. As a reporter, I exhausted a lot of passports as well. But I think that be able to look outside. I mean, you live in New York, so you have a luxury. You can travel to 5 countries within blocks, which is amazing, right? But not everybody has that experience. And so if you're really want to see the lens through a different, as an entrepreneur in different ways, I think any type of travel, ride your bike instead of drive, look up instead of looking down, get up before the sun rises. And because I'm not a morning person, I percolate slow, but when I do get up super early and I say, wow, I should get up at 5 a.m. every day. And then I realized, it's a little harder than I thought. But if you look, just go out of your comfort zone. Sometimes that discovery and that freshness and that first time experience, this is what, children are so great at this, they're so honest, is that kids will tell you. And I love that it's that AT&T commercial when the AT&T guy is in the library or the classroom with these little kids and he gets their opinion and it's like straight up honest. As adults, we start losing that because we get a little tainted. And so I think as an entrepreneurial, if you keep that entrepreneurial kind of experience and that enthusiasm, is get out of your comfort zone. Go do things, look at things. If it failed once, then take it. That's a different approach. Try it again. Take
Yeah.
it to a different city. Change the packaging. You know, show it. To a group of moms versus like actually had people that have created products they thought was for 18 to 25 male, and I'm like, really? I don't know any guys who'd use this product. Let's take it to a mommy's focus group. The mommies liked it. Far more engaging and more interactive. So those are the types of things I think that zip code I think is very powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Donna. And I'm guessing, you've been doing this for a while, right? You said you've had the agency for 20 years now, which is awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, I celebrated 20 years in the middle of the pandemic. No one noticed. I'm like, wow, we just had 20 years.
What does success look like at this point, right? Like sounds like you've gotten to work with some really amazing brands, incredible people all across the globe. And, it sounds like you're also more focused now on mission-driven companies. Like, but how do you define success for yourself and what you're building?
Yeah, you know what? It really is. It's pure delight and satisfaction at this point. I get excited when I still get excited and I literally squeal and my team does too. We're all have like former editorial backgrounds. And so we were all, story writers and journalists. But when clients get coverage that moves the dial, right? An article actually brings in orders, or we introduced a product at CES and within a year there's 50 million, then 60, then 70 and 80 million in revenue. That is success. That's measurable impact and success. So that's what I get most delighted, is to really see things come to life, and just the impact that some of these products can actually make on individuals. So I worked with motorcycle helmet company years back, before, when it was based on augmented reality, and we created an international phenomena with the product that basically had eyes in the back of its head. And that was actually the language that I created that would actually save lives. People don't want to talk about death. They want to talk about the upside of things. Working on products that can literally impact and save lives. I work with a crime fighting robot company, Nightscope Robotics. These robots can actually prevent crime. They can actually hallmark and help law enforcement to bring the bad guy in, or the bad gal in some cases. So to me, that's reward.
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome, Donna. I really appreciate you sitting down. There's been a lot of fun. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with, something that we haven't discussed, or kind of final words? And then also, please let everyone know how they can connect with you outside of this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. My podcast actually, I think, is a good entrepreneurial place for people to go kind of hang out. Before It Happened is really about the visionaries and the future we imagine. And so we touch a lot of topics within those conversations with these individuals and how they had their big idea and brought it to market. I also get into, tough, some of the challenges that they had, and how do they actually come from that? So I always say Guy Raz talks to the unicorns. I talk to the acorns, the ones that are actually just beginning to grow and branch, and to help bring their stories to life. But the Before It Happens show, you can find on Instagram and all the major platforms. Anybody who wants some PR wisdom or go to launch wisdom, best to reach me on LinkedIn as Donna Loughlin, and that's Loughlin. You will find me there. But that's, I welcome anyone who has any questions upon listening to this. And I love, networking and mentoring. So that's, those are the best places to find me.
Awesome. Fantastic. Donna, thank you so much for sitting down.
Thank you. There's a fire in the background, but it's not over here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Apologies.
Oh, I know how to handle fire drills as well. That's the key, the reason of being agile, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry. I get a lot of noises being in New York, as you know, they're all around. So
Noises and really good smells.
either really good or the exact opposite. There's a hard line.
I
there.
was thinking pretzels and, things like that on the street, but
Yeah.
anyway, well, great. Thank you so much. And I love what you're doing here, Silicon Alley. And thank you for letting me have a bit of a time travel to Silicon Alley today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Donna. On your way out, please share the podcast with others. It's the only way that the community grows and others hear these incredible stories from entrepreneurs and top performers. And of course, pound that subscribe button so you get notified when episodes drop every Friday. I'm William Glass, CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and of course, your host of the Silicon Alley Podcast. Have a very profitable day.
You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle